And going live. Good evening, and welcome to your Cannabis Equity Minutes with Cynthia Mompoint. Thank you all for joining us. Just waiting over here. All right, we've got our YouTube crowd joining in, and we are live on several platforms via the Mass Mother Mary website. Shout out and thank you to you all, as usual, for those of you who are supporting the work that we're doing here at Mass Mother Mary. All but shout out also to those of you who are on the ground putting in the good fight for equity. And if not familiar, here, Cannabis Equity Minutes is a check-in where I'm just providing some just updates on things that are happening across the nation, with the heavy focus on conversation of things going on in the cannabis industry in Massachusetts, mainly because a lot of folks want to look to Massachusetts when it comes to progressive measures. And while Massachusetts has some things that they've put in place that other states and cities have gleaned from, Massachusetts has a long ways to go when it comes to the conversation around equity, cannabis equity, social equity, buzz phrases and terms that are thrown around often. And so for tonight we're not going to spend too much time digging in, but just wanting to remind people, because there are a couple of decisions coming up in the next couple of weeks, and we're going to be paying attention to where the conversation on equity is in these spaces, looking at different states that are pushing for equity. And even here in the state of Massachusetts, our Cannabis Control Commission, our regulatory body, has regular decisions that they're making, policy decisions that they're making that have an impact on equity. And so our look is to see, are they factoring those who have been harmed the most by the war on drugs when they're making these decisions to ensure that their presence and participation and their power is at the seat of the table in these decisions? So, and we haven't seen that. And how do we know we haven't seen that? The numbers tell you that, the data tells you that. And even though the data is not 100% accurate, because there are skews to the data, for instance, if you're looking at minority participation isn't just Black and brown folks. That includes anyone who identified as a minority. Or in Massachusetts, we have a public tracker that shows you how many businesses in the cannabis space are operational. Right now, we have 230 businesses, and it will let you know what was the priority status for that business. Were they an economic empowerment priority status? Were they, which was, there's only 123 of those certificate holders, the majority of them being Black and brown folks. Or were they a social equity participant? Right now we have in Massachusetts over 400 people, I think it's upwards of 470, 480 social equity program participants. The demographics has not been released by the state yet on the second cohort, but we do know from the first cohort that a good portion of the social equity participants included folks that were not Black and brown. So I think there is a misconception when people hear the term social equity or they hear the term minority, they automatically associate it with Black and brown people and assume that that's who the supports and resources are going to, when especially in the context of the war on drugs, the harms that were that ensued, the communities that were destroyed. The data, the history, the information all centers around Black and brown people who were harmed by this. And so here we have now folks looking to see, well, what are you doing to address that? And how are we empowering the communities, empowering the individuals and their families to enter into this industry, into this space? And as we do so, we want to hold people accountable. We want to hold people accountable so that we don't have these feel-good moments and saying, hey, we're doing equity or we're trying to do equity, when in fact, your actions, the outcomes tell a different story. I constantly want to harp on the participation, presence, and power, because when we were under prohibition, participation was constantly, we were demonized. And I say we, Black and brown people, were demonized for their participation with the plant. And now we've shifted and folks have identified a way to legalize it, i.e. monetize it and tax it for big corporations' benefits and for the benefit of many people, which that's fine. This is America, and as long as there is room made for everyone to participate, and in this industry there is space for that because everyone was participating in it during Prohibition, right? So now the government's like, wait, let's make some money on this. We just want to make sure that those in power are also reflective of those who have been part of the traditional market. And that's not what we've seen. That's not what we've seen here in Massachusetts. And it's caused a lot of confusion, a lot of angst, a lot of misinformation going out into the community, and when it didn't need to be that way. Massachusetts is poised to be a very powerful front runner in terms of demonstrating what we can have in a state that prioritizes equity, in a state that grounds the conversation of equity, social equity in its proper context in terms of those harmed the most by the war on drugs. And it's not used as a leverage or a flag to tell the residents, hey, hold on a second, we've got folks that are going to be getting priority status we want to see come into the space. And then what we see are multi-state operators who come in with no requirement, no intention, no necessity, if you will, no responsibility or accountability for holding their weight in supporting the state's charge around equity and equitable participation. And so what we have here in Massachusetts, we have folks like myself, my husband, and other people working on the grassroots level to come up with ways to see equity. And what are we talking about equity? We're talking about ownership. We're talking about positions of power. What we see as the momentum for legalization across the country has taken place, we see people saying, yes, we need to legalize it, legalizing, and the conversation is starting to get watered down as to what equity actually looks like. We have strong measures and campaigns for expungements, which, yes, expungements are important because we want people to have a clean slate. However, we don't want that to be at the expense of the government not holding up its responsibility for why that person even had a record for participating in the plant in the first place. That's one. And secondly, expungements don't equate to equity, because then we're left with individuals who are still fighting to address the trauma, to enter into an industry where the gauntlet, the political and the financial barriers that have been created around it are so great, it creates an even greater challenge to enter into that. So until we see conversations around descheduling it, until we see conversations around really empowering people to participate and be in positions of power, decision-making positions, and if we're not looking to be frank, we're not looking to white male owners, white male decision makers, white male people in prominent places with an audience and a platform. We're not looking to them to guide us in the space of equity, but we're really looking at the community. We're looking at those who have been harmed by the war on drugs, those who are doing something in the space of equity and can show, hey, look, this is what it looks like with ownership. We could talk about businesses across the country that have taken it upon themselves to say, hey, you know what, the government is dropping the ball on this, and we have our own social responsibility in this space, and we know what we can do to help individuals, to help communities directly, and put them in positions of power, put them in positions where they're able to open up businesses, hire those in the community, reinvest back into the community, and not reinvest back into orgs that aren't going to have a difference with that very population that had been targeted in the past. So, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in upcoming minutes. But for today, I just wanted to really drive home the conversation like, hey, the momentum is picking up. We have legalization in 17 states now and the District of Columbia. And so where do each of these states stand in the space of social equity? and what you're looking at, especially in these highly regulated states. Massachusetts is highly regulated. You pit Massachusetts against Oregon or some of these other states, and you're just like, whoa, the gauntlet for anyone to get in is high. And what that creates, while some may say, well, it allows for more regulation around public safety and public health with this plant, fair enough. But what it creates is an opportunity for people with deep pockets to come in without doing anything for equity. And the government plays a role when it comes down to renewing these licenses. What role the government plays a role in? What are you looking at in terms of what these businesses have done for equity? Was writing a check to a program sufficient? Or are we looking for businesses to have positive impact that shows where they can tell you and identify the number of other businesses they've supported, the number of individuals who have been harmed by the war on drugs that they have supported? And so these are the questions we're asking here in Massachusetts. We're looking for our regulators because they're the ones that are in positions of power. One of the major power positions they have is when it's time for the renewal. And you're looking at what they're saying they've done. They're giving you their docket, if you will, of their last year's performance. And they're telling you what did they do to positively impact their communities, positively impact the target areas that we've identified. How has that helped us as a state meet our mandate around equitable participation, particularly for those harmed by the war on drugs? Because that's how we've couched it, both in our legislation and in our regulation and the policy conversation, the policy language that we're using. So when we talk about other states, we have New York next door, we have Connecticut next door. These are states so New York has gone legal, Connecticut it's in the phrase right now. And it's important that regardless of what side your state is on, whether you are legal already or you are going legal or you are legal and you're now rolling out regulations, wherever you are in the process, it's important that you center the conversation around equity when it comes to decision making, and let the conversation not be lost or feel as though you've met your charge by simply putting the bucket of a minority or the bucket of disadvantaged businesses. These are businesses that, when we talk about any industry, we have marginalized populations. And so, yes, minorities across the board, any industry, we want to see their participation. However, in the space of cannabis, where we have a traditional market where, government folks call it the illicit market, law enforcement calls it the illicit market, but where we have the traditional market, and in that traditional market, we have the data that shows a strong presence by Black and brown minorities. We have that data. So, and we know that it exists already, that presence and participation. We need to see that same presence, participation on the legal side. And we're not going to see that if we have people in positions of power who are not sensitive to that. If we have people who have the opportunity to tap the shoulders of those in power and say, hey, I need you to look at this. If they're not saying we need to look at this through a cannabis equity lens, which isn't just a business equity lens. It isn't just who are those that aren't represented in the business space. It's who are those that aren't represented in the business space and should be because of their participation under prohibition and the price that they paid. I'm going to be going crazy with these P's, but I might have to include that in my hashtags here. But they are, all of these words are key and important when we're talking about equity in cannabis. I want to make sure I'm covering everything. The other point around equity in cannabis is we have it, we're legal. Massachusetts, case in point, we are legal, and other states are legalizing. When we talk about those who are in positions in power and the decisions that they're making, how do those decisions impact the community. What do I mean? For example, these arbitrary possession limits, right? We have limits on how many plants folks can grow, how much they can possess on them. And in the space of equity, cannabis equity, it's not something that we dive in too deeply because we're still fighting for the right to be operational and have businesses and stand alongside big businesses, small businesses, but the majority of them are white businesses. We're still fighting to get to that place, but equitable participation covers the whole entire gauntlet. So I think about these arbitrary limits and these arbitrary regulations, policies that are rolled out and put into place, and the impact that it has. You see, if someone tells you that the drug war, there was an era for that, they use the phrase, oh, the era of the drug war, as if to say that it ended, you can stop the conversation right there because they're not talking about equity. The drug war has not ended. So long as we have anything in place that says that someone can be arrested for the plant, penalized for their participation with the plant, the drug war ensues. Why? Because the enforcement of these rules and policies continue to be disproportionate. People are continuing to be arrested for this, and our children are the ones that are impacted the most. If you aren't familiar with the school to prison pipeline, I'll break it down for you. You know, I used to teach in the classroom in my previous life. I guess we're going on 10, almost 20 years ago. I taught in the classroom, and as we were working with our students, I taught third grade, and third grade is an extremely important and critical year when it comes to reading. Why? I learned in one of our sessions, our professional development sessions, is because they look at the data for third grade and they identify the number of students who are not reading by the third grade. They use that data to determine the number of beds that they're going to need for prison. They have already calculated that the way our systems are set up, and so this is why it's a school to prison pipeline, right? Because we have our school systems, we have our prison systems, and we have our pipeline, which is our law enforcement, where they've now put our law enforcement in our schools. And then our students who are getting in trouble, they tend to be Black and brown students. People who are in the education space know this. They recognize this. It's a conversation. You can type in education equity and you're going to see the same issues, right? You're going to see that our children are being disproportionately disciplined in the school system for fractions that their white counterparts are doing the same and not receiving the same types of discipline, the same types of punishment. Massachusetts, their data around school discipline is public as well. I think that's a strong point in Massachusetts in terms of putting out a lot of public data. Again, how they put it out is a bit skewed, but when you start to dig and look and you're like, wait a minute, the data says you are disproportionately penalizing your students. You look at who are the students that are being penalized for drug use disproportionately, Black and brown students. You can include poor students in that as well. I won't be dismissive of that. And when I say poor students, I mean poor white students. I won't be dismissive of that. However, disproportionately greater numbers around Black and brown students, regardless of class, right? So if you want to factor in this intersectionality of class, it does not make a difference. And this starts in our school systems and the pipeline continues. Our children, we have penalties still tied with participation with the plant, and our children are being disproportionately arrested for it. And our adults are as well. And so until it's descheduled on a federal level, so this is why you hear us saying legalizing it on the federal level is not enough. Yes, people will be happy that they can participate. And even if your state says you can't grow, there are a lot of people who may get away with it because law enforcement will just say, hey, yeah, that policy's it's garbage, you know. But for Black and brown people and their experience with the legal system, it has not always been fair. white supremacy centers around our law enforcement systems. And until we shift that, until we change the training that our law enforcement has, until we change the expectation and the accountability around it, we're going to continue to see these disparities. We're going to, the drug war is going to continue. What do we mean by a war? We mean by people who are targeted just for who they are, for their skin color, for where they live, and their participation with a plant that, had they been somewhere else, someone else, they would not be targeted in the same exact fashion. Do I have to say, yes, there are white people who get arrested for their use of the plant, or they are even harassed, even in legal states? Do I have to say that for some people to listen? If I have to say that, then you're not at the table for equity. That, again, the conversation is around equity and disparity, right? That's why we need the equity, because there is a disparity, and it's not just about individuals. However, individuals play into how we are able to calculate the disparity. And I don't know if that's lost on some folks. Hopefully it isn't. If you really pay attention to what's happening, pay attention to the news, pay attention to the pain that people who have been persecuted by our country for decades, since its founding, I guess the founding that we recognize in our school systems, I should say, the founding that we recognize in our school system. Since then, prior to then, Black and brown people, Black folks, because before there wasn't that distinction, have been persecuted, penalized, punished in disproportionately greater rates, and it's had an impact. And it's no different here in the cannabis space. What is unique about the cannabis space is that it's the legal side of it is ripe for opportunity for us to start to address it, and address it in a way where we could say, hey, we know our systems, our current systems, has not always been fair and just to people of color, to Black and brown people. And here we have an opportunity with an industry that is making billions of dollars and is on a trajectory to make multi-billions of dollars to address it and rectify it. And addressing it and rectifying it includes money, it includes capital, but it also includes positions of power, decision-making positions. It includes folding in those who have been marginalized, left out, and harmed into the inner circles and decision and erecting of this industry across the country, right? So yeah, we haven't had any major breaking news in Massachusetts on a government tip. I do want to just harp on something that does a conversation that does circulate, right? We do have several bills before our legislature that is tied to cannabis, and some of them can have an impact on equity, particularly around funding. And I think it's disingenuous and dangerous for people who have positions, platforms, to turn around and tell those who have been harmed we're saying, look, the state needs to do more, businesses need to do more. Here are things that we can do. I'm thinking of the PIES program as an example that we put out. I'm thinking of the GIFT program that another economic empowerment participant has put out. I'm thinking of different businesses that are doing their legwork around equity and really calling for a greater accountability across the state for that. And then for people to say, you know what, no, that's not equity because you're dealing with corporations or whoever however you're getting Black and brown people to have ownership, full ownership at that. We're not just talking about a bare minimum of 51% or 10% or something like that. We're talking about 100% ownership and control of businesses, right? And to say that they should wait for the legislature While everyone else is in this industry moving forward, making money, they should wait, because these bills have been on the table for some for 2 years now, some a year, some have been reintroduced, and wait in hopes that these decision makers are going to pick up the charge and ensure that not only does these bills pass, but that they pass in a way that we can ensure the funds and the resources and the supports are going to the people who should be receiving them. I think that's a dangerous place, and we don't want to pit that against what we have going in terms of movements and opportunities to do something right now. So yes, we have the legislature, they have their agenda. We need folks to continue to reach out and say, yes, we want equity at the center of the decisions that you're making. And we want to ensure that those harmed the most by the war on drugs are the ones who are given priority, who are given access to the capital, given access to the resources, the services that they need to push forward. And then we also want to hold people whose job it is on a day-to-day basis, whether it's in municipalities, whether it's the regulatory bodies like the CCC here in Massachusetts, to say, what are you doing on a day-to-day basis to ensure that we are moving this needle, not just reports, because while reports are important, they're great, they serve to inform the public, they serve to inform others who are looking to do something. Actions need to come with these reports. And one of the things that we have given to the CCC is the PIES program as something that's actionable, where they can look at and say, okay, we can bring this in and hold businesses accountable. Other states that are looking to roll out equity programs in their state, in their with their citizens, with their businesses, and within their industry, can also look to adopting a version of the PIES program where you are holding the businesses accountable. You are serving in your regulatory capacity to not only provide services directly through government funding, government supports, which are necessary. It was the government that waged this war, but everyone has a responsibility around ensuring that we effectuate equity. Everyone has an opportunity to play a role in it, a responsibility and then an opportunity. And so the PIES program does that. You are welcome to always reach out to find out more about the PIES program. MassMotherMary.com or any of the hashtags, social media handles with Mass Mother Mary ending with an I. You can always find that. If you, wherever you're watching this, you most likely can just reach out directly to me, and I'm happy to really walk through how that can happen on a tangible basis, and we can have an impact where the conversation now is something that's taken globally in terms of how we've shifted what equity looks like. We've shifted what the cannabis industry looks like. We're not constantly saying the same things, where we have people still being arrested, disproportionately Black and brown. We have an industry, yet another industry that's white dominated, male dominated. We have something that is more reflective of what it's traditionally been. So with that, this is just supposed to be a couple of minutes. Sometimes I get in a little bit deeper, and shout out to those of you who checked in, chimed in, and let's see if there were any questions or comments. Hey, Graham, I see you've quoted a couple of scriptures. Now, I don't know these scriptures off the top of my head, right? So if you want to chime in, but I presume there are connections. You've come in numerous times in support of equity, so I presume these are connections to either the charge for equity, the role we play as a society around social equity, hence the term social equity, right? Society. And I don't think I have any other questions on any of these other platforms. Shout out to, yes, Izzy, yes, they do. Yes, they do, in terms of folks having a responsibility. So we appreciate you coming through. Continue to track with us. We are dropping equity minutes. I'm dropping equity minutes with you on Tuesdays and Fridays weekly, continuing to drive the message home. Share these messages with those who are decision makers, those who you feel have not had the opportunity, the lens, the thought process to really ground the decisions that they're making in their positions of power in equity. And you see how that can have a detrimental outcome to the community. In Massachusetts, case in point, we're fast forward 3-4 years, and our numbers are still where we have 230 operators, and we have 17 disadvantaged business owners. We have 4 economic empowerment certificate holder owners and 2 social equity participant owners. And when you add that up, we're talking about 23 folks. And not to say that all 23 of them are representative of those who have been harmed by the war on drugs, but they are those who do qualify under the equity programs and have been able to open up businesses. So with that, we're going to wrap it up for this evening. Thank you so much for joining. Tune in on Friday. We'll be honing in the conversations around equity, looking at what decisions, what needles have been moved across Massachusetts, across the country, what conversations are emerging, and what folks are saying in that space. Feel free to reach out, leave your comments, and we will see you then. Thank you, and I'm going to end you here. I'm going to